Hello everyone, this is Dan. I wanted to make a second video on the coronavirus and sort of my observations of how it's affected my area, how the policies have developed in my state, and just kind of my opinion and take on all of it. As I said in the first video, we've had a stay-at-home order in Ohio since toward the end of March. A lot of that has continued, where you're not supposed to leave your home unless you have basically an approved reason, a particular reason for going out and leaving your home. At the beginning of May, the official stay-at-home order was technically replaced with what's called the Stay Safe Ohio order. And essentially it says almost the same thing with just a few changes, that you're still not supposed to leave your home unless you have a particular reason. But now you are allowed to go to various businesses. Different businesses have been allowed to open up over the course of the month. This was passed, as I said, at the beginning of May. Or not passed, there was no voting on it. It was just enacted at the beginning of the month. And different businesses have been allowed to open up over the last few weeks. And you are allowed to leave your home to patron those businesses, but aside from that kind of thing and exercise, and with a few other exceptions, you're still not supposed to leave your house. Basically, there's still a stay-at-home order, even though they're calling it the Stay Safe Ohio order now. Up to this point, only businesses that were considered essential businesses were allowed to be open, and I, in the first video, was pretty critical of that because some of these businesses that have been considered essential included things like restaurants, at least not in terms of eating in the restaurant, but takeout and fast food and stuff like that. Also, hardware stores and laundromats. You can look at the essential business list that I had posted on the first video that I did on the coronavirus, but I'll probably link it in this video as well. Along with, as I said, the Stay Safe Ohio order. If I remember, I'll also link the details of that order in the description bar, or in the bar underneath the description of the video. So, to be a little bit more specific, medical office buildings have been allowed to open up since the beginning of May for procedures that aren't considered, necessary, that aren't considered to be essential procedures. So now dentistries and stuff like that have been able to open back up for services other than emergency services. Construction businesses and offices have been allowed to open up since May 4th. And retail businesses were allowed to open back up on the 12th. Now, again, that's retail that is not considered essential products. So grocery stores and stuff like that have been allowed to, they've been open this whole time. But other retail businesses that sell goods that aren't considered essential have been allowed to open back up. Another change is that employees of most businesses now are required to wear masks, whereas before it was a company determined policy. Now you're supposed to wear a mask if you work basically anywhere, even whether it's in an industry or at grocery stores or other retail businesses. It doesn't matter. You're supposed to wear a mask unless for some reason you're not able to do so. So that's one of the other changes in the Stay Safe Ohio order versus the original stay-at-home order. So again, my main concern and my main criticism with the situation with the policies in Ohio is that if these businesses, not just essential businesses now, but most businesses aside from certain categories of businesses such as bars and clubs, they're not supposed to be open. Barbershops and salons, there are some businesses that are still not permitted to operate, but only those specific categories of businesses. If every other type of business is allowed to open back up, other than the exceptions that I just mentioned, then there's really no justification for not allowing people to leave their homes. Again, if the situation with a pandemic, which is what we supposedly have, which I agree to an extent, this coronavirus situation is a pandemic. If these businesses are allowed to open back up and it's supposedly safe to open up our economy as long as people are practicing social distancing and wearing masks and all this stuff, then the situation doesn't warrant not letting people leave their own home as they see fit based on what's best for them. And again, I agree with some of the rules, some of the laws that say you're not supposed to have more than 10 people gathering in any particular place, and that you're supposed to stay 6 feet away from people when you can. I agree with those policies and those procedures, but to say that you can't leave your home unless you're going to go to a business and buy stuff, or unless you're going to go to work, obviously that's another exception. Prior to this, that was an exception only to supposedly essential workers, but now it's to all these different businesses that are starting back up. If it's safe enough to go to work, and it's safe enough to be a customer in a business, then it's safe enough for you to make other decisions outside of your home. And that's my major criticism with everything that I'm seeing again. And I mentioned this in this first video to a large extent as well, but it's a game of, we want your economic productivity. We want your tax dollars. We want you to go out to work so that the state doesn't have to support you. But then the rest of the time, we don't want you to leave your home so that you remain protected, so to speak. That's not a valid argument. That's not a valid reason to have this policy, in my opinion. Either it's safe to leave your home and go out and do these things, or it's not. Either we have a pandemic that's serious enough to have these laws and we need to protect people consistently, or it's not bad enough for people to have to stay at home, and people in general, aside from some of the things that I just mentioned, aside from, extreme cases like groups of people getting together in big parties and stuff, you should be allowed to leave your home as you see fit and do what's in your best interest. So ultimately, as I've said, I think that this is just basically the government trying to protect itself over anything else. This policy is not consistent because, again, it says we want your economic value, but then the rest of the time you need to stay in your home. And I think it pretends to protect people when in reality it's just taking people's rights away. It's just saying, well, we're protecting you so that you don't freak out and so that you don't think that the government isn't doing anything. But really, we're just taking your rights away to make it easier for the government to manage this whole coronavirus crisis or situation. And that's my overall thought process on this, is that the government could be protecting people more, but they'd have to actually treat this as a serious pandemic in a consistent way in order to accomplish that. In other words, unless you work in the healthcare industry, unless you work with the food chain supply, because people do still need to eat even in a serious pandemic, unless you're in a truly essential job, we want you to stay at home so that we do reduce the spread of this coronavirus. Unless you had a policy that was consistent and justified the idea of staying at home by actually keeping people at home, I can't really take this seriously, and I can't pretend like this policy makes any sense. And that's my position on this, guys. I know some people think that it's a plandemic, so to speak, and that this is all just sort of something that the government's doing to see whether they can take people's rights away and whether there'll be anybody that stands up against this. I think that if it was a plandemic, it would be done better. I don't think they'd choose something like the coronavirus, because honestly, it's not really killing a high percentage of the people that it's infecting. I think if the government really was just trying to take over everything permanently, they would come up with a better reason with something that was more deadly, quite frankly. I know that's a kind of a morbid thought or a depressing thought, but I don't think this is a plandemic. I just think it's a matter of not letting something that's kind of a crisis go to waste. And it's also a matter of the government, like I say, wanting to protect itself. Because the bottom line is, guys, as long as there's no vaccine for this, as long as there's no way to prevent the spread of this virus, what good are we doing by having people stay at home? Yes, I know the whole idea of not overtaxing our resources is part of the argument that's made, but if more people continue to spread this virus, eventually it's going to tax our resources anyway. It's like, at some point, when do you stop protecting people from this after a certain number of people have already been infected? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but again, the point is, The government, I think, knows that there's really not much they can do to stop the spread of the virus other than to tell people to kind of use common sense and keep their distance. It's even debatable about how effective a lot of these masks are at preventing the transmission of this virus. So there are things we can do. I'm not saying that it's a complete lost cause, but I think that this is a matter of the government and our leaders knowing that they don't really have too many things they can do to stop this virus from having a negative effect on society and on the economy and everything else. And they know people are going to freak out. They know a lot of people are dependent on the government, frankly speaking, telling them what they need to do. And I think that they're concerned that if they don't say, well, here's what we're going to do to flatten the curve, so to speak, and to stop the virus from being spread, from being a calamity, there's really no plan that the government has. Their plan is to just take people's rights away and pretend that they're protecting them. I think that's really what it boils down to. I just think that they don't have a plan that's going to be effective. And so they think, well, if people figure out that there's nothing we can do, they're going to potentially protest for that reason. And they may start breaking the law and people may start freaking out. So let's basically kill two birds with one stone. And this is from the perspective of many of our leaders across the country, especially at the state level. And, definitely in my state, but I think this applies to a lot of other states as well. Let's kill two birds with one stone by taking people's right to protest and whatnot not away, even though you do still see protests. If people can't gather in large numbers, it makes that a lot more difficult. Let's make it to where people think that we're doing something, but all we're doing is preventing them from kind of getting together and opposing what's going on and getting together and basically figuring out that the government has no plan for this. Let's prevent people from gathering together, but then at the same time, just take their rights away. So in other words, I think it's a matter of we can pretend to be doing something to resolve this pandemic, which really without a vaccine, without being able to control the situation, we don't have a plan. If you're looking at it from the perspective of our leaders, it's like I say, especially at the state level, definitely in my state, we don't really have a plan to deal with this long term. So let's just tell people to stay at home. Let's just make them stay at home. That way, they're not going to go out and do illegal stuff. That way, it's more difficult for them to get together and protest the fact that we don't have much that we can do about the situation. And at the same time, we're satisfying the people that demand action, at least on the surface, even though we're not really doing anything by telling them to stay home and spreading a lot of propaganda. And let's face it, no matter how you feel, or really, I think no matter how you see this coronavirus issue, all the stuff about how staying home saves lives and we have to flatten the curve and we're all in this together. The fact that you are bombarded with that message every day tells you something. It tells me that our leaders are pretty desperate to convince people that this is doing something, when really it's like, no, it's not. Like, more people are going to continue to get this virus over time as long as there's no vaccine, as long as there's no cure for it. So if it's so contagious, it's not going to just go away. It's going to continue to spread and continue to spread. Yes, the idea of flattening the curve so we don't overwhelm our resources makes sense, but aside from that, it's like you're really just prolonging the situation more and more. And like I say, there's no end game to this until we actually have a cure for this virus. So I don't think that it's a pandemic. I think it's a matter of the government realizing we've got to keep people calm and we've got to make them think that we're doing something. And the way to do that all at once is to just basically take people's rights away, take away people's right to leave their own home, act like that's doing something, and that's going to calm down the people who want the government to take some sort of action, even though there's not necessarily anything our leaders can do with this virus, to be honest. And at the same time, for the people that are more independent-minded and whatnot, yeah, they may be pissed off that they can't leave their home as they see fit, but it's going to be harder for them to get together with other people and plan to, protest or plan to do anything that the government doesn't want you to do to challenge what's going on, because you can't meet in large groups, at least not physically in the same area. And then at the same time say, oh, you still need to go out and go to work. You still need to go out and spend money. But the rest of the time, you don't have the freedom to go out and leave your home. Again, that really doesn't make sense if you're trying to protect people. It only makes sense if you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. Now, there are 2 points that I want to conclude this video on, and this is the most important part of this video. Even if you disagree with most of what I've said, and you think that it is a pandemic, or you think that the stay-at-home order is completely justified, either way, no matter how your position differs from mine, there are 2 points that I want to make. One, please think for yourself. Please do your own analysis. Don't just believe what you see on the news in terms of thinking that you have to stay home, and for the people that don't want to stay home, that they're bad, that anyone that protests the current policy is bad or ignorant somehow. That's what you're going to see on the news media, is basically reinforcing the current policy, reinforcing what our governor says, what our state health director says. And I'm sure, like I say, that this doesn't just apply to Ohio. That's the situation here, but from what I gather, that's still the situation in a lot of other states as well. Don't just believe what they're telling you because that's what they want you to think. Think for yourself. If you think that the evidence supports the idea of having a stay-at-home order, then fine, as long as you're reaching that conclusion by your own ability to understand the situation, by your own ability to think for yourself. A lot of people are not doing this. A lot of people are jumping to conclusions about what's going on based on what the media tells them, based on how they feel. All I'm saying is come to your own conclusions. Don't just buy into the propaganda. Don't just buy into whatever nonsense you see on social media. Do your own thinking about what's going on, and don't let other people convince you that you have to think a certain way in order to be on the correct side, because that's what a lot of people are doing, especially a lot of the people that think that, our governor and our state government in general is doing a good job and they have the right policy in mind and all that. A lot of them, they're just repeating whatever they hear on TV, repeating whatever they see on social media, and they're going to do whatever the government tells them to do. Even if you agree with our governor's position and with the position of our state government to a large extent, please do your own thinking and reach your own conclusions based on what's going on. The second main point, the second conclusion that I want people to consider is, if this virus was something so much worse, how do you think our society would respond? How do you think our leaders would respond? Even if you completely believe that this is a huge pandemic, which is very debatable as far as the severity of the coronavirus, most people who get it don't really have life-threatening symptoms. A lot of people who get it don't even know they have it at all because they have such mild symptoms. But even if you want to make the case and say, yes, this is a serious pandemic, what if the mortality rate was 5% or 10%? Do you think, given the reactions that you see from people, that our society would even survive such a thing? The irony that I see with this is that really, for the most part, only people who are sick and old, who have health problems to begin with, those are the only people that have severe symptoms. In the vast majority of cases, people really get sick from this coronavirus strain. It's mostly old people and other people who have weakened immune systems, basically sick people, people who are already not doing well. And I think it's interesting in a way because only a society that's not doing well and that's sick and that's dying would have such a major problem handling something like this coronavirus. Think about it, guys. There have been societies that have survived the plague. There have been societies that survived all kinds of other pestilence, all kinds of other major calamities that are objectively worse than what this coronavirus is. I'm not saying that they prospered. I'm not saying at all that they thrived. They didn't. And some societies, of course, have failed and collapsed due to things like pestilence, due to things like disease and famine and whatnot. But honestly, guys, this coronavirus is not that bad compared to a lot of examples, many examples that you can look at historically. If we had something worse going on in our society than the coronavirus, do you even think our society would survive? I think our society is like someone who is old or sick and has a compromised immune system and who struggles to survive something like the coronavirus as a result of that. I think our society itself is like that. And I'm talking about the Western civilization, not just Ohio, not just the United States, but Western countries in general. You've got to really think about this, guys. And I'm not really someone who is a prepper. I can't consider myself that because of my overall life situation, and that's a different topic. But you need to realize that the government is, in our society in general, is not going to survive something that's a whole lot worse than what this coronavirus is. Because if something like this is able to shake the foundation of Western culture, of Western society, if something like this is going to cause this kind of response from the government that just flat out says, oh, we're just going to take away your right to leave your own home. Even if you think that that's reasonable, given the circumstances, I just don't see how something a whole lot worse would not lead to something even more catastrophic. This is really not that bad, and yet you see how people are reacting. You see how our leaders are reacting to what's going on. And to me, the second major point that I'm concluding this video with is our society is not doing well. This confirms to me that we are in a state of severe decline as a society, as a civilization, for something like the freaking coronavirus strand that kills a very small percentage of people that it infects. Again, I'm not saying that it's not a major issue. It is. I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything about it. We should. But honestly, guys, if that's going to do so much damage to our economy, what does that say about our economy to begin with? If that's going to cause people to react in a lot of the ways that we're seeing, where people are just really off the wall in terms of how they view something like this, they just don't know what to do, or they just believe everything that they see on TV, they believe everything that the state tells them. What does that tell you about what people are going to do in a situation that's so much worse, that could easily happen? We need to prepare for our society to continue to decline and eventually fall apart. Because honestly, in my opinion, if something like the coronavirus is going to cause this kind of response, both from the state, both from the government and the people, we're screwed, guys. We're not in good shape. We are not healthy as a society to have these kinds of problems as a result of something like the coronavirus compared to so many things that could be worse. So again, those are the two conclusions that I draw from this. Is, yeah, of course, like I say, I don't agree with this Stay Safe Ohio order. If it's safe enough for people to go out and work at non-essential jobs, if it's safe enough for people to go out to these businesses that are supposed to be opening back up, then it should be safe enough to leave your own home as you see fit, as long as common sense things like social distancing and not being at parties, as long as that kind of policy is followed, this should not be necessary. It should not be necessary to require people to stay at home unless they go out for an approved reason. But again, whether you agree with my reasoning, think for yourself about these issues and realize that, man, we are not in good shape as a society to have this kind of response where the government feels like it has to crack down on people, or at the very least is using the situation as an excuse to take away some people's pretty basic rights to leave your own home as you choose, to leave your own home when you think that that's within your interest to do that, to make your own decisions as far as that goes, because of a virus that kills like 1% of the people that it infects. That's not good, guys. I'm not saying it's not a serious issue, but the fact that we have this sort of reaction to it, both from the perspective of our leaders and our government and from the perspective of people in general, that does not indicate that we have a healthy society. Like I say, It's the sick people, the people with compromised or weakened immune systems that suffer the most from this virus. And I think likewise, it's the society that is sick and in decline that reacts this way to something like the coronavirus. Things could be so much worse. And if they were worse, if this disease was worse, or if we had a catastrophe in our society, what are the chances that our society could survive that? I don't think they're very good. And like I say, think for yourself, but look at the broader implications of what's going on.